There are moments when a man learns what a badge really means. Not what it's supposed to mean. What it actually protects when the law stops watching itself. I learned that lesson on a Tuesday afternoon in Harlem, standing 10 feet from my father while a cop beat him in the middle of Lenox Avenue. Broad daylight. Witnesses on every corner. Nobody moved. The cop's name doesn't matter anymore. What matters is that he wore his authority like armor, and he believed that armor made him untouchable. He was wrong that my father wasn't a politician. He wasn't a preacher or a businessman with connections downtown. He ran a small shop on 135th Street, sold dry goods, extended credit to families who needed it. People knew him because he was steady. Reliable. The kind of man who remembered your children's names and asked about them when you came in. That steadiness made him valuable to the neighborhood. It also made him vulnerable. Because in Harlem, during those years, being respected by your community meant nothing to the men who patrolled it. If anything, it made you a target. They didn't want leaders they couldn't control. They wanted compliance. Silence. Fear dressed up as cooperation. My father gave them none of those things. He wasn't loud about it. He didn't organize protests or write letters to newspapers. He simply refused to acknowledge that a badge granted permission to humiliate people. When officers came into his shop and demanded free merchandise, he told them the prices. When they insisted, he repeated himself. Calm, clear, unmoved. That kind of quiet resistance doesn't go unnoticed. It accumulates. And eventually, someone decides to make an example. The beating happened because I had embarrassed a captain's nephew 3 weeks earlier. The nephew ran numbers out of a pool hall on Amsterdam Avenue. He'd been skimming from collections, pocketing money that belonged to people higher up the chain. When those people asked me to handle it, I did. Quietly. No violence. Just a conversation that ended with him returning what he'd taken and finding work elsewhere. His uncle didn't see it that way. He saw his family name attached to a problem, and he saw me as the source of that problem. But he was smart enough to know that coming at me directly would start something he couldn't finish cleanly. So he sent a patrolman. Young. Eager. Looking to prove himself to the department and the political machine that controlled it. The patrolman's instructions were simple: find Bumpy Johnson's father and make it public that it was late afternoon. The street was full. Women coming back from market. Men standing outside barbershops. Children playing stickball in the gaps between parked cars. My father was carrying 2 bags of flour back to the shop when the patrolman stepped in front of him. I was half a block away, walking toward him. Close enough to see everything. Too far to stop what was already in motion. The patrolman said something I couldn't hear. My father responded, and I knew from his posture that whatever he said was respectful but firm. That wasn't enough. The patrolman shoved him. Not hard. Just enough to make him stumble, to make the flour bag slip from his hands and split open on the pavement. White powder spread across the street like snow. My father looked at the mess. Then at the patrolman. He didn't say anything. He just bent down to gather what he could. That's when the first blow came. A fist to the side of his head that knocked him sideways. He caught himself with one hand, tried to stand, and the patrolman hit him again. Then again. I started moving. Not running. Walking. Fast and controlled. But before I covered half the distance, 2 other officers appeared from a storefront. They didn't touch me. They just stood in my path, hands on their belts, eyes locked on mine. One of them said, "Keep walking, Bumpy. This doesn't concern you." I stopped. Not because I was afraid. Because I understood what they wanted. They wanted me to react. To give them justification. To turn this into a story about a criminal son assaulting police officers in defense of his father. That story would end with me in a cell or worse, and the beating would be forgotten by morning. So I stood there. I watched my father take blow after blow while a crowd of 40 people formed a silent circle around him. I watched the patrolman's confidence grow with every punch. I watched him glance at me between strikes, making sure I saw everything. He wanted me to understand that the badge made him powerful. That uniform and authority granted him the right to do this without consequence. I understood something different. I understood that he had just made a mistake he didn't have the experience to recognize. When it was over, my father was on his hands and knees in the flour dust, breathing hard. Blood ran from his nose and split lip. The patrolman stood over him, straightening his uniform, making a show of dusting off his sleeves. He looked at me one last time. Smiled. Then walked away with the other 2 officers flanking him like an honor guard. The crowd dispersed slowly. A few people helped my father to his feet. Someone brought water. Someone else offered to walk him home. I didn't move until he was steady. When he looked at me, I saw no anger in his eyes. No shame. Just a weariness that came from understanding how the world worked and knowing there were limits to what resistance could accomplish alone. He said, "Go home, son." I nodded. Then I turned and walked in the opposite direction. That night, Harlem talked. People who saw the beating told people who hadn't. Details changed with each retelling. Some said my father had cursed at the patrolman. Others said he'd reached for something in his coat. By midnight, there were 3 different versions of events, and none of them mattered because the truth was already buried under speculation. What didn't change was the central fact: a cop had beaten a respected man in public, and nobody had stopped it. That fact settled over the neighborhood like fog. It reminded everyone of their place. It reinforced the idea that authority could act without accountability, that power flowed in one direction, and that resistance brought pain. I let people talk. I visited my father, made sure he had what he needed, and then I went home and sat in the dark. I didn't make phone calls. I didn't gather allies or plan meetings. I sat still and thought about structure. Because the patrolman wasn't the real problem. He was a tool. A weapon wielded by someone else. And weapons don't think. They don't choose targets. They get pointed and they act. What I needed to understand was who was holding him. How tightly. And what would happen if that grip loosened. The patrolman's name was Vincent Carlucci. He'd been on the force for 3 years. Before that, he'd worked construction and run small-time errands for the Irish crews in Hell's Kitchen. He had ambition but no real skill. What he had instead was family. His uncle, the captain, had arranged his entry into the department. His cousin worked in the DA's office. His brother-in-law ran a social club that laundered money for politicians. He was wrapped in connections that made him feel immune. But connections are only as strong as the people maintaining them. And people have patterns. I spent the first 24 hours mapping those patterns. Not following Carlucci directly. That would have been noticed. Instead, I watched the spaces around him. Where he ate. Where he drank. Who walked with him and who avoided him. What I found was interesting. Carlucci was protected, yes. But he wasn't respected. Other patrolmen tolerated him because of his uncle, but they didn't trust him. He talked too much. Took credit for arrests he didn't make. Borrowed money and paid it back late. That kind of man accumulates resentment slowly. People don't confront him because the cost is too high. But they remember. And when the right moment comes, they step aside. I needed to create that moment. The second day, I did nothing visible. I made sure people saw me at my usual places. I played cards at a social club on 132nd Street. I had lunch with a lawyer who handled property disputes. I walked through the neighborhood at my regular pace, nodding at familiar faces, stopping to talk about nothing important. I wanted everyone to see that I was calm. Unbothered. Operating exactly as I always did. Meanwhile, I had 3 conversations that mattered. The first was with a man who worked in the precinct's records office. He owed me a favor from 2 years earlier when I'd helped his brother avoid a gambling debt that would have gotten him killed. I didn't ask him for files or evidence. I asked him one question: who had Carlucci arrested recently that might have family willing to talk? The second conversation was with a bartender who served drinks to off-duty cops. He told me which officers complained about Carlucci. Who felt he was reckless. Who worried he'd get them killed because he didn't know when to de-escalate. The third conversation was with someone who knew the captain's schedule. When he worked late. When he went home. When he was too busy to notice what his nephew was doing. I didn't explain why I needed this information. I didn't have to. People understood that when I asked questions, there was a reason. And they understood that helping me was an investment. By the end of the second day, something had shifted in the neighborhood. People were watching Carlucci differently. Not obviously. But I could feel it. The way conversations paused when he walked past. The way storekeepers didn't meet his eyes. The way even other officers gave him slightly more space. Fear does that. It spreads through silence. And once it starts, it doesn't need much fuel to keep burning. I didn't start the rumors myself. I didn't have to. Harlem has its own way of processing information. Someone had seen me talking to the records clerk. Someone else had noticed me having coffee with a lawyer. Someone connected those dots and reached a conclusion. Bumpy Johnson was moving. That conclusion didn't need to be accurate. It just needed to exist. Because once people believed I was planning something, Carlucci's protection started to feel less certain. His uncle's influence started to feel distant. The question shifted from whether something would happen to when. And Carlucci felt it. I know he did because his behavior changed. He started taking different routes home. He ate at different places. He looked over his shoulder more often. Fear is contagious. And the irony is that it spreads fastest among people who believe they're untouchable. 72 hours. That's the window I chose. Long enough for paranoia to build. Short enough that institutional protection couldn't fully mobilize. Long enough for Carlucci to second-guess every shadow. Short enough that he couldn't leave town without raising questions. The number itself mattered. It's biblical. It's the space between death and resurrection. It's the time it takes for a story to solidify in people's minds. I wanted those 3 days to become legend. I wanted people to remember that when Bumpy Johnson's father was humiliated in public, exactly 72 hours passed before the man responsible disappeared. Not 71. Not 73. 72. Precision creates mythology. On the third day, I made one move. I didn't touch Carlucci. I didn't send anyone to threaten him. I didn't sabotage his car or plant evidence or bribe witnesses. What I did was simpler. I had a conversation with a deputy inspector who hated the captain. Their rivalry went back years, something about a promotion that got stolen through political maneuvering. The deputy inspector had been waiting for an opportunity to undermine his rival without exposing himself. I gave him that opportunity. I mentioned, casually, that Carlucci had been collecting protection money from businesses on Lenox Avenue. I didn't provide proof because I didn't have any. I just planted the idea. Let him know that if he looked closely enough, he might find something useful. What made this work was that Carlucci actually had been collecting protection money. Small amounts. Nothing organized. Just freelance shakedowns that he pocketed himself without sharing with his uncle or the department. The deputy inspector didn't need much encouragement. Within 6 hours, he'd started an internal inquiry. Nothing formal. Just enough to create paperwork. Enough to make the captain ask questions. By that evening, the captain had called his nephew into his office. I don't know what was said. But I know that Carlucci left the precinct that night looking pale. I know he went home instead of stopping at his usual bar. I know he made 3 phone calls from a payphone on Amsterdam Avenue, and each conversation lasted less than a minute. He was realizing that his protection had limits. That his uncle couldn't shield him from everything. That the badge he'd used as a weapon could just as easily become a target. Carlucci didn't show up for his shift the next morning. His sergeant called his apartment. No answer. His uncle sent 2 patrolmen to check on him. The apartment was empty. Clothes still in the closet. Food in the refrigerator. No signs of struggle. He simply wasn't there. The precinct filed a missing persons report after 48 hours. Standard procedure. But there was no urgency behind it. No search parties. No appeals to the public. Because everyone understood what had happened, even if no one could prove it. Carlucci had vanished. Not because someone had killed him, though that's what people assumed. But because he'd recognized the inevitable and run. He'd realized that staying meant facing internal investigations, angry criminals, resentful colleagues, and a community that would celebrate his downfall. He'd realized that his uncle's protection was political, not personal, and that protecting a liability wasn't worth the cost. So he left. Probably hopped a train to Chicago or Detroit. Changed his name. Found work doing something that didn't require references. The official story, the one that circulated through the department, was that he'd been transferred. Reassigned to a precinct upstate. Nobody asked for details. Nobody followed up. He just stopped existing in Harlem. What happened next was more important than Carlucci's disappearance. The precinct changed. Subtly. Officers who used to swagger through the neighborhood started walking a little more carefully. Shakedowns didn't stop, but they became more selective. More cautious. Because a precedent had been set. A cop had beaten a respected man in public. 72 hours later, that cop was gone. No trial. No arrest. No public confrontation. Just gone. And everyone understood that someone had made that happen. Someone had reached past the badge, past the department, past the political machinery, and made a man disappear. That kind of power doesn't announce itself. It doesn't need to. It just exists, quiet and absolute, in the space between action and consequence. My father never asked me about Carlucci. He didn't need to. A week after the beating, he reopened his shop. The bruises had faded. His customers came back. Life continued as it had before. But something had changed. People looked at him differently. Not with pity. With respect that came from understanding that what had been done to him had been answered. That the humiliation hadn't been left to rot in memory. That someone had cared enough to make it right. He never acknowledged it. Neither did I. We simply went about our lives, knowing that the neighborhood understood what a badge really meant. And what it didn't. Years later, people still ask me about Carlucci. What really happened to him? Whether he's alive or dead. Whether I gave an order or just created conditions. I never answer those questions directly. Because the truth is less important than the story. And the story is that when you put on a badge and use it to humiliate people who can't fight back through official channels, you need to understand that there are other channels. Older ones. Channels that don't require courtrooms or paperwork. Channels that run through patience, observation, and the simple recognition that institutional power is only as strong as the people willing to enforce it. When those people step aside, even for a moment, the badge becomes just metal. The uniform becomes just fabric. And the man wearing them becomes just a man. That I learned something else during those 72 hours. I learned that respect isn't given. It's enforced. Not through violence for its own sake, but through the willingness to act when action becomes necessary. Through the understanding that authority without accountability creates monsters, and monsters need to be reminded that they're mortal. The neighborhood remembered that lesson. So did the police. For a long time after Carlucci disappeared, there was an understanding. Not peace. Peace was never possible in that arrangement, but equilibrium. A recognition that power flowed in multiple directions, and that pushing too hard in any one direction created consequences. That equilibrium lasted until new people arrived. New cops who hadn't heard the stories. New politicians who thought they could rewrite the rules. But that's a different story. What matters now is that you understand how power actually works. Not how it's supposed to work according to civics textbooks. How it works when the system's designed to check it fail or refuse to act. A badge is supposed to represent law and order. But law and order require consent. They require the belief that justice is possible through proper channels. When that belief dies, when people see that the systems meant to protect them are instead weaponized against them, other systems emerge. Older systems. Systems built on loyalty, reputation, and the quiet understanding that every action has an equal and opposite reaction. Those systems don't advertise themselves. They don't hold press conferences or issue statements. They simply exist, waiting for the moment when official power overreaches and creates the space for unofficial power to respond. Carlucci created that space when he beat my father on Lenox Avenue. He thought the crowd's silence meant consent. He thought their fear meant acceptance. He was wrong. Their silence meant calculation. Their fear meant memory. And 72 hours later, that memory produced consequences he never saw coming. That I didn't make Carlucci disappear. I made it impossible for him to stay. There's a difference. One requires violence and risk. The other requires understanding systems well enough to make them work against themselves. Understanding that institutions protect people until protecting them becomes too expensive. Understanding that fear, once redirected, does most of the work for you. Carlucci disappeared because staying was worse than running. Because his uncle couldn't justify the political cost of protecting him. Because his colleagues didn't trust him enough to stand between him and whatever was coming. I simply made whatever was coming feel inevitable. And inevitability is the most powerful force in the world. You can't fight it. You can't negotiate with it. You can only accept it or run. Carlucci ran. The last time I saw my father before he died, we sat on his porch watching the sun set over Harlem. He was old by then. Tired. But still steady. He said, "You didn't have to do what you did." I didn't ask what he meant. I just nodded. He said, "But I'm glad you did." We sat in silence for a while. Then he said something I've never forgotten. A man's dignity isn't something someone can give back once it's taken. But knowing that someone tried, that matters. He was right. Dignity, once stolen, can't be fully restored. But the effort to restore it, the willingness to act when action is dangerous and complicated, that effort says something. It says that some things matter more than safety. More than convenience. It says that respect is worth defending. Even when the systems meant to defend it won't. People remember the beating on Lenox Avenue. They remember Carlucci's disappearance. They remember the 72 hours between them. What they don't always remember is the quiet part. The part where nothing visible happened. Where I walked through the neighborhood doing ordinary things while pressure built in spaces no one could see. That's the part that mattered most. Because power isn't about grand gestures. It's about understanding leverage. Understanding systems. Understanding that the people who look untouchable are often held up by structures more fragile than they realize. Find the weak point in the structure. Apply pressure. Wait. The system does the rest. That I never spoke to Carlucci after that day. Never saw him again. Never needed to. He existed as a lesson. A reminder that badges don't grant immunity. That authority requires restraint. That pushing people too far creates responses institutions can't control. Some people learned that lesson. Others didn't. The ones who didn't learn it later, the hard way, when they discovered that Harlem had its own justice system. Slower than the courts. Quieter than the law. But absolute in its own way. I wasn't the only one enforcing it. I was just one part of a larger network, people who understood that when official channels failed, unofficial ones had to step in. Not out of lawlessness, but out of necessity. Out of the recognition that survival required creating consequences for people who believed they were beyond consequence. That network still exists. In different forms. Different cities. Different circumstances. But the principle remains the same. When power becomes abusive, it creates opposition. When that opposition can't operate in daylight, it operates in shadow. And shadows, when used properly, are just as effective as sunlight. Sometimes more. So when you ask me what happened to Vincent Carlucci, I'll tell you what I tell everyone. He made a mistake. He believed his badge protected him from consequences. He learned otherwise. How he learned it doesn't matter as much as the fact that he did. And that 72 hours after he beat my father in front of everyone, he was gone. That's the story. That's the lesson. And that's enough.